Yep, it's official. I'm ready to be hurt again. Against my better judgment, I am allowing myself a pinch of excitement for the House of the Dragon, which is something I could not have said at any point since the 2019 finale for Season 8 Game of Thrones. I want to be very clear, I could talk for hours about everything wrong with the final 4 seasons of that show, and nothing I could say about it would be unique. It's all been said before. It's been ripped to shreds on every corner of the internet, and for good reason. I have never in my life seen a worldwide sensation fade from public consciousness in the way that Game of Thrones did. 1 month, it felt like everyone on the planet was tuned in, waiting to see how it all concluded. There were ads, there were shitty mobile games, the merchandise machine was cranking out goodies left, right, and center. Celebrities were on board with it. Everybody was talking about it. It was everywhere. And then, nothing. It all just kind of disappeared overnight. The showrunners took 6 years of goodwill, hype, and character development and essentially threw it all in the garbage can. And as a result, the series tarnished its legacy irreparably. I mean, really, the character assassination was out of control near the end, and many of the major plot points felt unearned, sloppy, rushed, and really entirely devoid of the intelligence that characterized earlier seasons. Gone was the sharp wit and dialogue. Gone were the careful maneuverings of Tywin Lannister, Varys, and Peter Baelish. Gone was pretty much everything that made the show what it was, except the huge budget and production values. At least those stayed consistent, but really it turned into a Michael Bay movie with a bunch of fan service that made zero narrative sense. The Dorne storyline, one of my favorites in the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire, was butchered. Like, every single element that made it great in the books had a fat, steamy turd dropped on it in the show, to the point where the writers literally gave up on it, killed everyone, and moved on. Which, looking back on it, was maybe our first hint that something bad waited for us in that final season. And that's, of course, to say nothing of what they did to poor Tyrion, Jon Snow, and Daenerys Targaryen. Still, I can't hate D&D entirely. I won't fully immerse myself in the circle jerk. If you're going to credit them with running the show into the ground, it's only fair to acknowledge what they did well, and when the show was good, it was great. There's a reason it became a worldwide sensation in the first place. And while adapting already existing narrative was obviously their main strength, they still wrote a good many scenes and tons of dialogue that never existed in the books that ended up being absolutely fantastic in the show. They did some great work. I still have plenty of fond memories from watching, but I'm perfectly happy for them to never get close to another George R.R. Martin property ever again. They killed an awesome IP, and I washed my hands of it. I stopped caring. So when I heard a prequel show was in development about the Targaryen bloodline, and even when the initial teaser dropped for it, I paid very little attention. Like I said, I didn't care anymore. I had no plans to watch it, at least until I heard from nerds that I trust that it was worth getting invested into. But a new trailer dropped a few days ago, and I couldn't help myself. I felt hyped for the first time in a long time towards anything related to A Song of Ice and Fire, because God knows those books ain't ever getting finished, at least not while George is alive. But I had thought the House of the Dragon would be set way back in the timeline, like maybe right after the doom of Valyria, before Aegon's conquest, following the early Targaryens and leading up to their invasion of Westeros. But no, this is hundreds of years later, when the Targaryens are already the major powers on the mainland, and their most dangerous enemies are themselves. What I didn't realize until very recently, because I was so disconnected from it, was that House of the Dragon is instead set during the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of Dragons, one of the wildest periods in Westerosi history, which is saying a lot, because this universe is about as brutal and violent and bloodthirsty as it gets for any fantasy story, but still trying to maintain a somewhat realistic approach. It's an amazing story arc, the kind of narrative that makes you lose faith in humanity. Minor spoiler warning here, I'm not going to get into the narrative or plot points too much, but I do need to explain some of the basics so you guys can understand why there's at least a faint glimmer of hope on my end. So House of the Dragon is set about 130 years after Aegon's War of Conquest, when he and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys forced 6 kingdoms into submission with their dragons Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. Most of those characters are of course long dead by this point in the story, but there are a few holdovers from that period of history, and they will play a huge role in the story arc of the Targaryen Civil War. Viserys, first of his name, is king, and his reign has been a prosperous one, with his family strong and secure. They have more family members, more dragons, more land, more wealth and power than really any other point since the doom of Valyria. But all is not well, because the ruling family and court is sundered right down the middle. On one side, we have Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's firstborn daughter and essentially the main character of the show, who is named heir to the throne, and on the other side is the king's firstborn son from his second marriage, Aegon II. At first, things are mostly amicable. There's some internal politicking and rivalry there, but over the years, things get a lot more heated. The issue, naturally, comes down to the line of succession when Viserys dies, and though he named Rhaenyra as his heir, she's off at Dragonstone when his will is proclaimed, and so the family still in King's Landing decides to take power. They split into two rival factions, the Greens, made up of Dowager Queen Alicent Hightower and her family, supporting her son Aegon II, and the Blacks, the party of the princess, made up of House Velaryon, supporting Rhaenyra. As the old saying goes, a wheel with two hubs will not turn, and a kingdom with two kings will burn. And predictably, very quickly, things start getting out of hand. So I'll tell you why I'm excited for the show, and why I think it has the opportunity to succeed in a way Game of Thrones did not, even if I don't believe it will ever be quite as popular as Game of Thrones was. For one, the narrative has already run its course. There is a definitive beginning, middle, and end, which cannot be said for Game of Thrones, and was really at the heart of the matter for why the final 3 seasons plummeted downhill. The source material is all there and ready to go straight from day one, so we are much less likely to have a situation where the writers get bored of the series and decide to start pandering to the lowest common denominators to make shit epic, even at the expense of all consistency and logical character development. It's also a lot tighter and more condensed as a narrative than Game of Thrones was. This won't need 8 seasons to conclude. It takes the elements that many argue are the reason why George R.R. Martin will never finish Game of Thrones, that he's created such a vast web of interconnecting stories and diverging and converging plotlines with so many characters that he simply can't figure out a way to tie them all up in a satisfying manner, and makes things a bit easier to follow. Instead of following 6 different story arcs, we're focused on one, the War for the Crown. Now I will say, it can still be overwhelming and confusing at first, especially because all Targaryen names sound similar or are the exact same across generations. I mean, we have Rhaenys Velaryon, who has the same name as Aegon's hot sister from 150 years prior. There are 300 different Aegons and Aemons and Daemons and Daenerys's, but once you put a name to each face in the show, it's really not too bad. And at its core, this narrative has everything that made Game of Thrones great in its first 4 seasons, without the danger of gallivanting off into Dorne to butcher an entire story arc that doesn't end up mattering in the slightest. I think this story could be done justice in maybe 3 full seasons, so it's tighter, it's more focused, and that makes it easier to follow and write for, without danger of the showrunners growing bored so they can go make a shitty Star Wars movie that never happens. It has all the betrayal, political intrigue, and interesting characters that we've come to expect from a show like this, but it's also going to have dragon fights, probably in the first season, which is something that took a super long time to build up towards in the past. And this show is about as ambitious as it gets, right? Because half of the important characters here are dragon riders, and they all get stuck in, either against other dragons or against big-ass armies and navies, which means budget is going to play a huge factor here too. And there's really no other carrier that handles big budget better than HBO. Even powerhouses like Amazon and Netflix consistently churn out content that looks kinda cheap. I mean, look at The Witcher, Wheel of Time, or The Rings of Power. They look kinda off in certain elements of those shows, like the worlds aren't really lived in. And even though they have enormous budgets, there are parts of all those shows that look kind of cheap. In my opinion, that's something Game of Thrones always got right, that it looks like a really high budget movie, that the CGI is super well done, that the wardrobes and costume design are brilliant and feel real, and everything I've seen from House of the Dragon so far gives me those same sorts of vibes. I just hope the executives over at HBO saved up a nice hoard of cash from Game of Thrones, because if they want to do it justice, we're going to be seeing a lot of dragons, many of which are a hell of a lot bigger and more intimidating than Drogon was in the final season. Now, they actually made Drogon too big too fast in the show, which is another can of worms entirely, but compared to monsters like Vhagar, who Visenya rode during Aegon's initial conquest of Westeros and will be ridden by Aemon One-Eye in this show, Dany's dragon should be absolutely dwarfed. I mean, Drogon was what, like a couple years old, maybe 6, 7 years old at most, but I don't even think that. Vhagar was like 180 by the time the Dance of Dragons began, so yeah. If a dragon keeps on growing its entire lifespan, it's gonna be way bigger than Drogon was in Game of Thrones, which should give you an idea of just how epic some of these dragon duels should be. One thing I'm really interested to see is how they handle the fact that very few of the main players here are even likable. I love shows where even the protagonists are morally gray, and that's very much going to be the case here as well, but I'd argue the stage is set for pretty much everyone in this show to be morally reprehensible at best, and just kind of mean. This is total war. No holds barred, kill or be killed, and if you happen to get caught in the crossfire, sucks to be you, even if you're innocent. They all end up doing some pretty despicable stuff that should make you hate them. There isn't really a main character like Jon Snow to root for, so I'm interested to see how they end up handling that from a narrative perspective. But one thing that will absolutely not lack in are a bunch of badasses. Daemon Targaryen is a badass. Aemon Targaryen, his nephew, is also a badass. Half the main characters in this show ride dragons and know how to use them to a devastating effect, but they turn into absolute shit people, and many of them start out that way. So, I don't know. I kind of relish the idea of a show where most of the main cast is vain, power-hungry, kind of villainous, and willing to do absolutely anything to win. I'm not sure it will have the same kind of impactful twists we got out of, say, The Red Wedding, but I also think the highs of it have the potential to surpass anything we saw in Game of Thrones. And the conniving, scheming, and politicking are still going to be front and center, of course, with the battles and dragon fights punctuating the sharp, well-written dialogue that characterized the first 4 seasons. Or at least that's my hope. Plus, Ramin Djawadi is returning, and his Light of the Seven soundtrack, alongside the main theme, of course, are magnificent, legitimately iconic at this point, and I think his music has the potential to really kind of push this show into that next echelon. Overall, I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic about the House of the Dragon, and even if it has a rocky beginning, I hope HBO won't be like Netflix and just pull the plug. This narrative deserves to be seen to its conclusion. It is incredibly epic. I think the cast, crew, set design, and budget seem to be indicating they're looking to go all out with this one and apologize for what was probably one of the biggest television disappointments of all time. It's going to be dark and depressing and brutal, but I'm here for it, and hopefully it will deliver. I'll be watching with great interest. So let me know your thoughts about House of the Dragon after reading Fire and Blood or seeing the trailer itself, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.